Africa in the diaspora is regarded as the sixth region of the continent. So massive is it in size and value that it has become one of the single most significant community of Africans. By 2050, Africans in the diaspora are expected to be in the region of 100 million people, with more than $50 billion in inflow from the diaspora to African governments. The establishment of the African Diaspora Finance Corporation for the growth and development of the continent is a largely supported idea. Is this one of the keys to opening the locked doors of growth on the continent? Welcome to VSA. I'm Felicity Ezewuike. More than 30 million Africans today live outside their countries of birth. About 60% of this population stay within the continent. With a massive population in the West, a growing population in the East, and a great number of Africans still on the continent, remittances are growing. These remittances from the diaspora have been significant to the growth of many African nations. Yearly, for instance, Benin Republic receives more than $100 million from Nigeria and more than $60 million flows from Congo to Rwanda. A large population of these nationals are in other African countries. The birth of the African Diaspora Finance Corporation is a means to make the diaspora work for the betterment of economies in Africa. It is a social enterprise operating as a non-AU financial institution with partners across the continent in global finance, development organizations, and diaspora institutions. What does this diaspora corporation promise for Africa? We'll be joined much later on the program by Dr. Chiwuike. But for now, let's start with our brother from Kenya, Mr. Trevor Hambayi, a financial analyst and senior partner with the Development Finance Associates. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much and good evening, Felicity.
Good evening. You're actually from Zambia, right?
Yes, I'm actually from Zambia, but even if you put me in Kenya, I wouldn't be very far from it.
We're all Africans after all. Apologies for the mix-up. Let's begin. Most people got to hear about this corporation in February when the AU Executive Council formally adopted the Strategic Business and Operational Framework for an ADFC. For the benefit of those who might not have heard about it, what is this corporation's purpose?
So, the African Diaspora Finance Corporation is basically an entity that has been established by the AU. And it is basically an entity that is, firstly, the Executive Council in February approved at the 40th session and what they did and the operational framework of the institution. The African Diaspora Finance Corporation is basically going to be an independent non-AU financing entity that is going to be looking at having to basically finance into the social enterprise, but is looking at having to be able to harness the resources that are being generated by Africans that are in the diaspora, whether it is continentally or across the continent in the West or the East, that are actually remitting these funds onto the African continent.
Okay, apparently heads of states and government first made a commitment for a legacy project on the diaspora investment almost a decade ago, 2012, in South Africa. Why did it take so long to materialize?
Felicity, that is one of the challenges that we seem to have on the African continent in terms of actually implementation of strategies that we agree on. It takes a very, very long time, which you have seen with this one that has taken now 10 years to come into play. We have got the same issue with the Africa Trade Free Zone that has taken almost 6 years to come into fruition. Even though that a number of African countries had ratified this, it wasn't implemented. So in essence, we've got a very slow process of having to regulate frameworks that we agree on the African continents, for them to go through the different countries, and for each country to approve this and then come back to the AU and say, yes, every country is on board, or we've got a quantum number that meets the requirement for us to be able to take this to the next level. So it's a bit of a challenge for the African countries to be able to do this. And you must remember that the African continent is very diverse. It cuts across 3 different language across the continent. That you've got the Portuguese African countries, you've got the French African countries, and you've got the Commonwealth British countries. All these ones need to be able to come to agree if we're implementing an African Union strategy. And I think this is why it takes a very long time.
As I don't know what to think about the slowness, but well, at least we're finally here. There's something to celebrate for most people. Let's understand, what are some of the untapped options and opportunities of diaspora investment in finance?
Felicity, what you do realize, actually, the African continent possesses massive opportunities in terms of investment. Now, the challenge that you do see in terms of investment for the African continent is that we're a continent that is built on small enterprises. Most of the European countries want to invest in large corporations where they're investing at the $5 million, $10 million. Whereas the African continent, in terms of where we are, though that invest opportunity that we carry as Africans is usually from small ticket sizes, that we're looking for $20,000, $100,000 up to that we do have, because this constitutes around 96% of the private sector within the African continent. So this is where the opportunity comes, but that opportunity is not very attractive to the large investors out from outside the continent. And very important that we as Africans try and find these resources locally to be able to invest into these entities. But once we do this, it will also ensure that the revenue that we generate from these investments is actually going to stay within the African continent. And I think this is perfect timing. What you have seen is that the Ukraine-Russia war is going to create a new world order around financing in the space that it is different who is going to draw the card as to whether the global currency is going to be the US dollar or something different. And this is important for the African continent to ensure that we can start to be able to harness that potential that we can create within the African continent with our own resources.
You mentioned something I'd like you to expand on. A lot of the conversation I've seen on this subject is concentrated on, the focus seems to be on the remittances from those that are within the continent. When we say diaspora, is it more strategic that we're focusing on the people and what we can get from the continent, or it's transverse the globe?
I think it's more important that we take a holistic approach, and that holistic approach actually means that we will be looking at the ones that are also remitting resources from outside the continent. I do not have the exact numbers, but I believe that we have got more Africans on the European continent than there are on the local continent that are remitting with African countries. So it is important that we actually have this holistic approach that is going to bring in both the resources from the continental remittances as well as the local remittances on the African continent. In having to do this is that you must maximize the opportunity to its maximum potential, and it is important that you consolidate all the remittances that you're getting.
What makes its potential great for African countries, especially those without great financial strength?
One of the challenges that we have had on the African continent has obviously been the earnings of foreign exchange. And any remittances that are being made within the African continent between countries is guaranteed to be that it is in hard currency, that they have to remit this in hard currency. And this improves the strategic reserves of all the countries in terms of those resources that they receive, because then they are receiving hard currency, they have to convert this back into the local currency for the beneficiary to actually utilize in their country. So this is the first benefit. But the second one also is speaking from the intercontinental one, that when it does come in here, we can use to be able to conduct continental trade with the West, because we are receiving hard currency. And this speaks to every country. The challenge that we do have is having to be able to consolidate these remittances to ensure that we can speak as a continent rather than individual countries. And this is very, very important, I think, in terms of the AU having to approach this, because that's where the benefit is going to come. If we continue to receive this as individual countries, it will still not be able to make the impact that we're looking to be able to get.
Again, in Africa, we have strong and not so strong countries. How will such a cooperation ensure that there is equity in those that can come in, those that can get funding, those that can get the investment, and all of that?
So that comes as a second phase of what the African Diaspora Finance Corporation is looking to be able to do. Initially is obviously to be able to mop these resources into a centralized platform for where we can use it for social impact and investment. And secondly is that in terms of the investment, we must be able to determine the priority areas as who is going to benefit this. But in terms of benefit, it shouldn't be arbitrary that the weakest country gets the most resources. It must also be aligned to potential subscription payment, that the country that generates the highest resources must be benefiting the most in terms of having to get the investment back into the country, because this is the incentive that they can have. Otherwise, nobody's going to be willing to be able to be investing through their remittances, but not get back the investment into their country. And I think this is a cardinal issue. But it is also important. There are other areas on the African continent where we need to be able to improve in terms of interregional trade, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of trade policies. All these need to come into a balance for the investment strategy also to be positive in terms of the impact that it's going to create.
Would you say there's been enough value pushed by African countries to, and management, of course, to get diaspora remittances to allow investors come in? Because you mentioned earlier that investors would prefer large corporations than smaller ones.
Sorry, just repeat that question again.
Okay, I'm trying to find out from you how much value has been pushed by African countries in terms of their investment and their infrastructure and their management. When we talk about diaspora remittances, that will encourage and allow investors to come in. I referenced that to what you said earlier about investors that will look for larger corporations than smaller ones. With this kind of cooperation now, what do you think? Are countries ready to embrace what is coming?
So I'm a very strong advocate of African countries having to create innovative financing models that are speaking to our specific challenges as an African continent. What we have been seeing in the past is that we are driving an investment strategy that is speaking to the criteria of the West. And the Western criteria does not speak to the specific conditions that we have on the African continent. And that's why you have this disparity between the ticket size of what the West is looking for and what we as Africans have as an investment option. The fact that we can consolidate the investment that is coming from the diaspora is that the investment that comes from there is that everybody's making a small remittance towards having to do an investment. And we can then segregate this to be able to finance small businesses that require a small ticket size of $50,000, $100,000. And this is where the value lies. As long as we can create a financing model that is solid enough to be able to mitigate the risk that is associated with financing these small businesses, then we have got a very, very strong case to be able to drive impact and growth on the African continent. I think that is the value that this is going to bring, that we can structure it to meet our specific needs and then design it with the criteria for which we as Africans can meet.
This is a first for the continent, right? This sort of cooperation is a first for the continent when you talk about a diaspora investment, really.
Yes, it is a first, but in terms of the financial instrument that they're going to be implying, it is not a first. This is basically a very simple bond that they'll be looking at having to issue, and everybody buys into this bond, and then it guarantees that the resources are coming into one platform. The key aspect that you do see from here is obviously the fact that they are designing what they are calling a matching aid remittance, which is basically that when the funds are invested, there must be some local capital that has been raised to be able to match any money that comes from the diaspora. This is going to increase the investment platform, so it's going to double it. What it really means is that if this comes into onto the table and it actually works, is that we're going to be investing twice as much money as we're receiving. If there's $1 billion or $5 billion that is coming into the continent, we will match this with local investment, with local capital to be able to double this. And the investment strategy will then be carrying a portfolio of $10 billion.
As we're talking, I was thinking about the African Development Bank. We also have the African Finance Corporation, and then we're now having the African Diaspora Finance Corporation. What's the connection here for somebody who doesn't understand finances? And you talk about these corporations, the person would think that they all sound the same. Are they doing things? What really are they doing differently? Is the African Development Bank not doing some of the things that the Diaspora Corporation will be doing? If you can just break it down for a layman.
So obviously we are in the very early stages in terms of approval. I haven't seen the full framework as to how this is going to be implemented. But the key difference that I see, firstly, is what the African Development Bank is doing is that you'll appreciate the funding that comes out of the African Development Bank to any specific country is bilateral funding, which basically means that there must be an agreement between the bank and the government of the country where the funds are going to be implemented. And I think this is a major shift in terms of the African Diaspora Finance Corporation, that this can be done with the private sector without having to have a bilateral agreement, because this is an independent body of the AU. This is a very key movement in terms of financing growth on the continent. The challenge that we've had for a very, very long time is that the resources that go through government as bilateral funding, either from the ADB or from multilateral lenders like the World Bank or the IMF, is that when they do go through government, then the bureaucratic issues of the African governments come into play. There's also political mileage that comes, and then there are issues about abuse of how these funds are disbursed. And we never seem to achieve the the impact that we have targeted the resources for. And I'm hoping that in having to do this as the AU is that we're trying to get away from these specific challenges that will then allow specific countries to be able to implement this with the African Diaspora Finance Corporation without the bureaucracy of government bilateral agreements.
Okay, we now have with us Dr. Chiwuike Uba. He is a development economist as well as a public policy analyst. It's a pleasure to welcome you to VSA. Thanks for joining us. I'd just like to bring you up to speed. We've been having the conversation on the African Diaspora Finance Corporation, and Mr. Trevor has been explaining some of the benefits for us. I want you to jump in and maybe just give us your thinking as to the potential that this corporation has for Africa. Dr. Uba, can you hear me? Okay, I don't think he can hear me yet. We'll continue with Mr. Trevor Hambayi. Okay, we still don't have his audio yet. As soon as we do, I will reintroduce him to the program. Staying with the conversation around the distinction with different institutions that seem to do similar things. Basically, you've highlighted some of the differences. One major problem that we have in Africa is that of sustainability, continuity. Do you think that the creators, the AU has said it's going to be an independent body? Do you think that the plans that have been put in place is enough to ensure sustainability and maintenance of this corporation?
So from a sustainability aspect, I think the key aspect that you do see from the initial framework that we have looked at is obviously that the African Diaspora Finance Corporation is looking to be able to partner with other African and global institutions that are either in the development space or a diaspora institution that is looking to be able to put resources onto the African continent. And I'm hoping that they'll obviously be looking at other development entities, foundations, social investment firms that they can bring on board to partner with the ADFC to ensure that we can have a multiplier effect in terms of the resources that we do have. The sustainability part will come in the essence of ensuring that the investments that are made and that they're actually bringing back.
Okay, I think the network is just breaking up a bit. This will be a good spot to go on a quick break and see if maybe a refresh will get the systems working better. Please don't go away. This is Village Square Africa, and I'm Felicity Ezewuike. Stay with us. With bonds, mutual funds, and other investment strategies rolled out, There are outlooks set to fill gaps in diaspora finance, improve regulatory and institutional capacity on the continent, and set up business mechanisms to pursue market benefit. It's primed to help in African development by making diaspora remittances available to as many local institutions as possible. Human resource development, entrepreneurial support, and improvement of productivity are also listed as some of the expected benefits of the corporation's establishment. The ADFC's white paper states that it's operating as a full-fledged business with structure, design, and management of products coming from the corporation set out. An encompassing business model, it will help manage investment funds, build equity, and manage business portfolios for African development organizations and diaspora institutions. I still have Mr. Trevor Hambayi, and let's see if we can get Dr. Chiwuike Uba via phone. Dr. Uba, can you hear me? Dr. Uba, do we have you?
Yes, you have me. Thank you for having me this evening.
Thank you. These things happen. We're just glad to hear your voice and get your contribution. Go ahead. I was trying to ask earlier, we've gone a bit far with Mr. Hambayi, but I'd like your input here. What are the potentials you see with this corporation?
First, it's important. Let me first thank the African Union for approving the establishment of the African Diaspora Investment Corporation. It's a good initiative, and which should have happened a long time ago, given the paucity and the need for funding for investment in Africa, especially from diasporans. Prior to this time, as we all know, we have remittances from African diasporans, which ultimately is more than the development assistance that Africans receive. But because there are no vehicles that enable such funds to be properly channeled and deployed for investment in Africa, they filter away. And some of them are just used to taking care of basic needs of the persons that are living here. So for me, the corporation is something that will enable Africans to articulate and also to fund some of the investments, given the critical infrastructural gap that we have in Africa. So it's a good thing that is happening, and it has great potential as a result of the aggregation of funds that will come from Africans in diaspora.
Dr. Uba, but I just wanted him to complete what he was saying earlier. He talked about the importance of partnership. What kind of partnership are you looking at? We're talking about the AFDB, and we're talking about the other finance corporations we have in Africa. If you look at the establishment framework for the African Diaspora Investment Corporation, it recognizes the existence of other African institutions, financial institutions. Dr. Chiwuike,
I don't know if I heard your question very well.
Yeah, I was saying that you should just hold on for a bit. The question is actually for Mr. Hambayi.
Okay.
Okay, I'll be right back to you soon after he finishes. I just want him to complete his thought. Mr. Hambayi, did you get the question earlier?
I think you're asking the different partners that...
Yes, you talked about how important partnership is for this to succeed, and I'm asking, what kind of partnership are you thinking of when you talk about that?
So in terms of partnership, it's very, very important that they do have the partnerships, because then this creates the growth of the portfolio that they do have in terms of the resources. But it also allows other entities that are looking to be able to invest into the African continent to have a vehicle or platform under which they can do this. And you're obviously looking at both the African and the global development finance institutions, as well as private equity investors, social investment firms, as well as foundations that might be looking to be able to invest in the social sector. These will be able to bring additional resources for which the ADFC can then leverage to increase their investment portfolio. But this also mitigates the risk because then you spread it among different partners. The key issue that is very important to ensuring this partnership's strength is obviously the strength of the viability of the projects that the ADFC will invest in. And I think in designing the financing models that are speaking to this, one of the ones that they'll be looking at is obviously risk mitigation to ensure that they minimize the potential for loss of the resources. And this will allow the portfolio to actually grow. But the partnerships is what is going to bring in the strength of the size of the portfolio that they're going to have.
All right, Dr. Obad, I'm sure you heard some of the things he said. I want to stay with working with partners. The ADFC is expected to develop, issue, manage diaspora bonds and mutual funds to harness and channel diaspora savings and resources into socially responsible and projects that will be impactful in priority areas. What, in your thinking, would be some of these priority areas that should take precedence when leadership is deciding?
Yeah, I think I thank him for the insight he has brought to the conversation, because it's important that this partnership, as part, if you read the framework, it did recognize that the need for partnerships and what they expect to have from the other partners and institutions and all that. But beyond that, in investing, it's important. First, he said that they will invest more in social enterprise, about the profits into an endowment fund, and use the whatever credit that are accrued from that to now give out to other institutions for investment. But beyond that, Africa is still lagging so behind in terms of the basic infrastructures that are required, to crystallize the kind of development that is required. It's still very disheartening that Africans, and in Africa, we are still talking about basic transportation systems, the road networks, and also the required IT infrastructure. As you observed earlier on, I was not able to join in, using the Zoom because of network issues, hitches as a result of internet connection. In the 21st century, 22nd century development model and investment, we need also look at those issues that will enable the ease of doing business in Africa. And some of those things is the IT issues. So I would like to see investment in that area, like to see investment in education, like to see investment in health. You can't do much if these social sectors are also not doing very good, because they are the ones that will produce the kind of social or human capital that are required to drive the development. So as we look at those issues, the kind of investment that is those investments that will bring out the kind of returns both on the short, medium, and the long run. It's not just about the immediate profit that will come out. So as the investment are being made, we look at the social sectors, then we look at those kinds of portfolios that will bring the kind of money or return. I mean, the investments as quickly as possible. So it's going to be a pool that brings all kinds of things into it. So you need social sectors, you need the basic infrastructure, you need the IT, but it's not just that you start investing on road and all that, and neglecting those key issues that will drive the real development that is required in the continent.
Okay, let's show a bit of optimism here from my end and say that ADFC will be profitable, and the profits and surpluses will be invested in a legacy endowment fund. That is one of the rules that have been set out. And income earned from the endowment fund will be disbursed in the form of grants and soft loans to African development organizations and institutions, both in the diaspora and on the continent. Now, my concern and my worries are something that's I've even put that to Mr. Hambayi earlier. What is your worry about this aspect of the plan, considering the fact that we have a propensity to not only mismanage, but oftentimes to bring in corruption and spoil an opportunity that would develop us? Still, basically, what worries you here?
I think I want to see the cup as half full rather than half empty. Yes, we've made our mistakes. And which is why it's important that we have the kind of partnerships that are required. Because if you leave this whole initiative, in the hands of just African Union as it were, even though they say the framework is going to be independent. But if it's left at the control of the Union as it were, without having such partnerships that will bring very corporate governance matters into it, we might still experience what we have experienced in the past. But if we have a framework, an organizational structure that enables those kinds of international partnerships that will bring internal control or quality assurance mechanisms, I think we might not make the kind of mistake we made in the past. For me, let's start first. Along the line, we can keep revising based on iterative things and not rest of it.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Hambayi with the same question, but rephrased in another way, looking at one of the missions of the ADFC. It is to mobilize direct and indirect diaspora funds for structured investment in socially responsible and impactful ventures. How will accountability look like for you? Because that will always be a worry.
So I see a very interesting perspective in terms of how they seem to be designing the financing model. It is a consideration that they will have. I think it is very possible that they will have specific investment assets that they'll be looking at that are risk-free, that have got a minimum guaranteed return. And that guaranteed return is what they are going to be utilizing in terms of having to give allocations to the specific countries to be able to do entrepreneurship investments, or whether to actually work towards social investment on infrastructure or ICT. So in essence, yes, the key aspect before they are actually able to get this financing program in place is to ensure that we have created a governance structure which is accountable, and secondly, that mitigates the risk of loss, which is, are we investing in risk-free assets such as treasury bills, government securities, and then we're using the returns from there to be able to actually put into the high-risk investment that has got social impact. But I think they will really have to look at the issues that are speaking to governance. But the AU Executive Council approved the strategic plan, approved the operational framework, as well as the business strategy. So, and I think in having to look at those ones, we should be able to find what specific structures they put in place around accountability, governance, and sustainability.
The AU, I'm going to Dr. Obanao. The AU and heads of state have agreed that this corporation will be independent, away from any influences. How truly implementable is it that the AU and other regional leaders will not have some sort of stake in a corporation like this?
Well, for me, that was why when I discussed earlier, and I reiterated the need for those kinds of partnerships that will be like a check to what will happen. So it depends on the governance structure. Yes, it's good that statement has been made or signed, but it's also important that in terms of the organization, in terms of the structure is such that, removes control of the AU head of states and other from the management of that. So they will also just act as the conscience or a check also to the organization. It's possible, but it all depends on how the governance structure has been designed and how that will run. So, which is why it's also important that we have other recognized international institutions to be part of this whole process in terms of partnerships and all that. So, it becomes, you can see what happened with the African Development Bank recently when the president won and the petitions that came and how the United States of America put a hold on some of those things. It's because of the kind of partnership. If we are to be just the AU and Africa, that wouldn't have happened. So it's important that in the design of the structure that we look at those kinds of issues that will put a stop, or not a check, not just a stop, a check, on those kinds of issues that will stop or disrupt the free flow of free operations that they are taking. It's doable, it's possible, yeah.
Mr. Hambayi, what's your take?
It's a very interesting aspect that they're saying that the AFDC is going to be an independent entity that is not accountable to the AU. Firstly, in terms of the entity, is that it requires an oversight. So we might be able to create an independent board of directors to be able to look over the investment strategies of the ADFC. But I would think that the board will still have to report to a council of ministers or to the AU in terms of what is being achieved, because this is trying to create a legacy, an AU legacy that it is going to be supported. It must show some degree of accountability to the AU, and I do not think it can be totally independent. What might be independent is the executive operations of the ADFC. Yes, in terms of day-to-day operations, they should be independent, but there must be oversight that comes over here. And obviously that comes with a board, an executive board that is put in place to look over them. But the executive board will also have to report to the AU's main body, I think, either the Council of Ministers or to the AU board. I don't think it can run as an independent body altogether.
Yeah, but are there any implications here? Is it helpful to the purpose of the corporation to have these checks and balances when you talk about the influences that other bodies might have and the accountability to them?
The checks and balances are necessary. It is not debatable. We must have the checks and balances. And one of the key aspects that we do have, which is unfortunately an African issue, is that our checks and balances do not usually work as well as they should. That even with structured governance structures in place, we still get to a point where we have abuse of office, we have political influence, and we do get to a point where the decisions are not based on economic fundamentals, but more on basic interest of specific entities within the organizations. And it's very, very important that we walk away from this, especially where we're trying to be able to drive impactful investment with resources from African individuals who have worked for this, and they expect to be able to get a return because this is what they want to use for the benefit of both their relatives and their loved ones whom they are sending the resources to.
All right, let's go back to Mr. Dr. Uba, I beg your pardon. I asked this question of Mr. Hambayi earlier. I'd like to get your 2 cents on it, and that is, considering what we have now, we had the pandemic for quite a while, and then we have the war in Ukraine affecting all kinds of aspects in Africa. How strategic is it? It took a while for us to get here, but how strategic is it now that we have it? What impact do you see it will have to cushion or to counter what the pandemic has done and what the war in Ukraine is unveiling?
me, it's a progressive thing. It's not a one-off thing or one-stop thing. If you look at let me use Nigeria as a case study. In 2020, when we had the pandemic, diaspora remittances dropped so much. But in 2021, we saw a marginal, not just a marginal increase, we saw a jump in the remittances, that's why remittances, which shows that also that things are easing off. And also that also reflected on the Nigeria diaspora bond that was issued also, the subscription and all the rest of it all. So for me, yes, we've had COVID-19, we are having the Ukraine-Russia war and all manner of things with these attendant pending financial crisis and all the rest of it all. There's issues that we also would have a lot of Africans that are out there doing a lot of things who are spending so much here, but not in a structured way. I think when they are sure that the funds will be properly managed and will be invested properly, it won't have any negative effects on what we will have. We may not see the roof, in the first, second year, but gradually we'll get to where we need to be.
All right, I guess that's all time will permit us today. I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Chiwuike Uba, a development economist and public policy analyst. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Felicity, for having me.
And of course, we have from Zambia, Mr. Trevor Hambayi, a financial analyst and senior partner with Development Finance Associates. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
And of course, you that's been watching, I hope this program has been beneficial today. We thank you for the company. It's been really nice being here, holding the fort for Sulaiman Alade. He will be back tomorrow and you will have a good time. Thank you for keeping us company. Bye for now.